Have you ever wondered what happens to child predators once they're behind bars? This video is for you. From cold-blooded inmate J Sanderson, who strangled his child molester cellmate with shoelaces and felt zero remorse.
Ken got what he deserved. I believe that with all my heart. You know, I hit him a couple times and I pulled the chair back and sat in the chair, and then he kind of got up posturing on me.
To Jonathan Watson, who brutally clubbed two convicted child molesters to death with a walking cane in a single day after prison officials ignored his explicit warnings.
48-year-old prisoner David Bob died that day. 62-year-old Graham DeLewis Conti died 3 days later. Both men were serving life sentences for aggravated sexual assault on a child under the age of 14.
In this video, I'll take you inside the brutal world of what happens to child predators in prison. Gioan. Gioan was once a respected Catholic priest in the Boston area. For decades, he served in various parishes throughout Massachusetts, presenting himself as a man of God dedicated to serving his community. But behind this facade of piety lurked something far more sinister. Over the course of 3 decades, Gioan is believed to have molested nearly 150 boys, using his position of trust and authority to gain access to vulnerable children. His case would later become a central focus of the Boston Globe's Spotlight Team investigation, which exposed not just Gioan's crimes, but the Catholic Church's systematic protection of predatory priests, moving them from parish to parish when allegations arose. In 2002, Gioan was finally convicted of indecent assault and battery for groping a 10-year-old boy in a swimming pool. He was sentenced to 9 to 10 years in prison, but Gioan would never serve his full sentence. On August 23, 2003, while incarcerated at the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts, Gioan became the target of another inmate, Joseph Druce. Druce, who was already serving a life sentence for a 1988 murder, had reportedly planned the attack for more than a month.
Guy was talking about molesting kids. It was in my head. You know, he brought everything back out of me that I tried to push away. You know what I mean? So be it.
Druce says he was molested as a child and physically abused by his father, a man he says also forced him to take drugs and drink at a very young age.
On that fateful day, Druce followed Gioan into his cell after lunch. Using a book to jam the cell door and prevent guards from intervening, Druce bound and gagged Gioan with a t-shirt, then strangled him with a bed sheet. By the time prison guards managed to force their way into the cell, it was too late. Gioan was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after. What makes Gioan's case particularly notable is that at the time of his death, he was being held in a protective custody unit, specifically designed to keep vulnerable inmates safe from the general prison population. Despite these precautions, Druce managed to carry out his attack. During his trial for Gioan's murder, Druce, who had been diagnosed with various mental illnesses including bipolar disorder, claimed that he had killed Gioan to protect children. According to court testimony, Druce believed that Gioan would eventually be released and harm more children. He also revealed that he had been sexually abused as a child himself, and hearing Gioan talk about molesting children brought everything back.
But because you have the type of victim that you have, I think the jury is going to think twice about convicting Druce.
Video we've been showing you was video of them racing to the prison cell right after Gioan had been killed.
Druce's defense team argued for an insanity plea, with one psychiatrist testifying that Druce was the most insane person he'd ever seen. However, prosecutors countered that Druce had carefully planned the murder and knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to the fact that he had jammed the door to prevent intervention and had specifically targeted Gioan as evidence of premeditation. The jury ultimately rejected Druce's insanity defense, finding him guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to an additional life term without the possibility of parole. Gioan's killing highlights a grim reality for child predators in prison. Even in protective custody, they may not be truly safe. The case also raises questions about the prison system's ability to protect its most vulnerable inmates, regardless of their crimes. But perhaps most disturbing is how Gioan's murder was received by the public. Many openly celebrated his death, viewing it as justice served outside the confines of the legal system. This reaction reflects a broader societal attitude toward child predators, one that sometimes sees vigilante violence as an acceptable response to their crimes. After Gioan's brutal murder showed how even protective custody couldn't save a child predator from prison justice, let's examine another case that reveals the calculated nature of violence against these inmates. Theodore Dyer. In 2014, another case emerged that would shine a spotlight on the dangers child predators face behind bars. Theodore Dyer, a 67-year-old convicted of molesting a 9-year-old neighbor, was serving a 25 to 50-year sentence at Michigan's Saginaw Correctional Facility. Like many sex offenders in prison, Dyer had kept the nature of his crime secret from his fellow inmates, understanding all too well the danger such knowledge could bring. However, when Dyer was assigned a new cellmate, 51-year-old J Sanderson, his secret wouldn't remain hidden for long. Sanderson, who was already already serving a life sentence for a 1991 murder, somehow discovered the truth about Dyer's conviction. What happened next was captured in chilling detail during Sanderson's court testimony, where he calmly and matter-of-factly described how he killed Dyer after learning about his crimes against children.
You just go ahead and tell us what happened.
All right, I guess he decided to clear his conscience or something, but, you know, he told me what he was in prison for, that he had, you know, was accused of raping an 11-year-old girl, and he got 25 to life for it, and, you know, I told him that's enough, I don't want to hear any more. I first, you know, punched him a couple times.
According to Sanderson's testimony, Dyer wouldn't stop talking about his crime, which enraged Sanderson to the point that he felt compelled to act. What's particularly striking about Sanderson's account is the deliberate, almost methodical way he describes the killing.
Still wouldn't shut up. Still kept telling me he wanted to explain that he didn't do it, that he was being set up and all this stuff, and I don't know, I just got mad and then hit him and then I killed him. When I hit him and knocked him out, and then I took the shoelaces out of his shoes, tied them together, wrapped it around his neck, and strangled him.
After killing Dyer, Sanderson displayed a remarkable presence of mind. He covered Dyer's body with a blanket, went to sleep in his own bed, and even packed up all his belongings, anticipating that he would be sent to solitary confinement once the murder was discovered.
Right after you do.
So,
and the reason for doing that would be?
Because when you go to the hole, that's usually what the police do, to pack it up, and I figured, yeah, they're going to tear my shit up, so let me just do it myself.
When asked about his actions during his court appearance, Sanderson expressed no remorse. In fact, he explicitly stated that he believed Dyer deserved what happened to him.
You know, I just don't have any empathy for people, so...
So basically, what you did, you figure Ted got what he deserved.
Ted got what he deserved. I believe that with all my heart.
Okay.
You know, I hit him a couple times, and I pulled the chair back and sat in the chair, and he kind of got up posturing on me.
Sanderson's actions and attitude reflect a chilling but common sentiment among many inmates that crimes against children are beyond the pale, and those who commit them deserve harsh punishment, regardless of what the legal system has already imposed. For his role in Dyer's death, Sanderson was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to another life term. Given that he was already serving life without parole for his previous murder conviction, the additional sentence was largely symbolic. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Sanderson's response was succinct. "I don't know if it makes sense, but the answer is no." The case of Theodore Dyer illustrates several key aspects of what happens to child predators in prison. First, the knowledge of their crimes can make them immediate targets, which is why many sex offenders try to keep their convictions secret. Second, even cellmates can become deadly threats if they discover the truth. And finally, the violence against child predators isn't always spontaneous or hot-blooded. It can be calculated and deliberate, carried out by inmates who genuinely believe they're delivering a form of justice. What's particularly striking about Dyer's case is how Sanderson framed his actions not as an emotional outburst, but as a moral obligation. In his mind, he wasn't committing a crime. He was performing a service by removing someone he viewed as irredeemably evil from the world.
I guess, I don't know. I know murdering somebody's not a good thing, but I mean, Jesus, man, if the things this guy did, things he said he did, I wouldn't want someone like that on the street again. So I do what's necessary. I do what some people won't.
The almost matter-of-fact way Sanderson describes his actions and the lack of concern for the consequences, given that he was already serving life, offer a window into the mindset of inmates who target child predators. For them, it's not just about violence or asserting dominance. It's about enforcing a moral code that, in their view, the formal justice system has failed to adequately uphold. While Theodore Dyer's killer methodically executed what he considered justice with homemade weapons, our next case shows how prison officials sometimes receive direct warnings before tragedy strikes. Jonathan Watson. In January 2020, a similar incident occurred at California's Corcoran State Prison, except this time, the perpetrator didn't target just one inmate, but two. The case of Jonathan Watson would further illuminate the dangers child predators face in prison, as well as the complex dynamics that can lead to violence. Watson, then 41, was already serving a life sentence for a 2009 murder conviction when he was transferred to a lower security program at Corcoran. Within hours of this transfer, Watson would commit an act that would shock even the hardened prison system.
An inmate at Corcoran State Prison has confessed to the murders of two other inmates last month. 41-year-old Jonathan Watson confessed in a letter that he clubbed both men to death with a cane on January 16. He wrote that his reasons for the attack were because those two inmates he killed were child molested. 48-year-old prisoner David Bobb died that day. 62-year-old Graham DeLewis Conti died 3 days later. Both men were serving life sentences for aggravated sexual assault on a child under the age of 14. Watson claims he had altercations with the men in prison and had told a prison counselor prior to the incident that he might become violent. He says that counselor ignored him. 2 hours later, he attacked those two inmates.
What makes Watson's case particularly noteworthy is that he didn't keep quiet about his actions. Instead, he wrote a confession letter to the Mercury News, a Bay Area newspaper, explaining in detail why he had killed David Bobb and Graham DeLewis Conti, both convicted child molesters. In his letter, Watson described how he had been growing increasingly agitated after being transferred to the lower security facility where he was housed alongside sex offenders. What particularly infuriated him was seeing one of his victims, Bob, watching PBS Kids in the common area, which Watson perceived as taunting him and others. Most troublingly, Watson claimed that he had explicitly warned prison staff about his intentions. According to his letter, he had told a counselor that he might become violent and requested a transfer back to higher security. When this request was ignored, Watson took matters into his own hands. Armed with a cane, Watson first attacked Bob, striking him multiple times in the head. He then went after DeLewis Conti, delivering similar blows. Bob died that same day, while DeLewis Conti succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. In his confession letter, Watson didn't express remorse for the killings. Instead, he framed his actions as a necessary response to what he saw as the system's failure to properly handle child predators. He reportedly wrote, "I was willing to sacrifice my freedom, my life, to help put an end to the victimization of children." Watson's case highlights several important aspects of prison life for child predators. First, it underscores the danger of housing sex offenders with the general prison population, even in lower security settings. Second, it reveals how certain behaviors can make child predators even more vulnerable. In this case, Bob's decision to watch children's programming was perceived as provocative by other inmates, but perhaps most significantly, Watson's prior warning to prison staff raises serious questions about institutional responsibility. If his account is accurate, it suggests that authorities might have been able to prevent the killings had they heeded his warning, a troubling possibility that points to potential systemic failures in managing the volatile dynamics between different inmate populations. Following the killings, Watson was moved to segregated housing and faced new murder charges. His case prompted an internal investigation into whether prison staff could have prevented the deaths, but ultimately, corrections officials concluded that staff had followed proper procedures. Watson's story illustrates not just the extreme violence child predators may face in prison, but also how that violence can sometimes be telegraphed well in advance. In the claustrophobic world of prison, where emotions run high and conflicts are difficult to escape, the hatred directed at child predators can simmer until it boils over into deadly violence, often with little effective intervention from those tasked with maintaining order. Jonathan Watson's open confession about killing two child molesters demonstrates how some inmates see violence against these offenders as a moral duty, but not all attacks are so public, as our next case reveals. Robert E. Cole. The dangers facing child predators in prison aren't limited to high-profile or historical cases. They continue to occur with alarming regularity. One recent example that underscores the ongoing risks is the case of Robert E. Cole, a convicted child molester who was found dead in his cell at Mule Creek State Prison in California in April 2025. Cole, who was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for violent sex crimes against children, was discovered unresponsive in his cell during a routine security check. Despite immediate medical intervention, he was pronounced dead at the scene, with preliminary reports indicating that his death was a homicide. Authorities quickly identified Cole's cellmate, Justin P. Welsh, as a person of interest in the investigation. While details of the killing weren't immediately released, the case follows a pattern seen in many prison homicides involving child predators. They often occur in the confined space of a cell, with a cellmate as the perpetrator. What makes Cole's case particularly significant is that it occurred at Mule Creek State Prison, a facility that has seen multiple violent incidents in recent years. In fact, Cole's death was just the latest in a series of homicides at the prison, highlighting systemic issues in how California manages its inmate population, particularly those convicted of crimes against children. The timing of Cole's death is also noteworthy, coming at a moment when California's prison system was already facing scrutiny for its handling of vulnerable inmates. According to data analyzed by various prison safety advocates, sex offenders in California's prison system face a disproportionate risk of violence, accounting for nearly 30% of homicide victims despite making up only about 15% of the prison population. This statistic is particularly alarming given that California's prison homicide rate has been consistently higher than the national average. Between 2001 and 2012, the state's prison homicide rate was approximately 8 per 100,000 inmates, double the national average, and it rose to 15 per 100,000 by 2012 to 2013. These numbers suggest a systematic failure to protect vulnerable inmates, regardless of the nature of their crimes. Cole's death also raises questions about prison housing assignments. In many cases, prison administrators try to house sex offenders together or in protective custody to minimize conflicts. However, resource constraints, overcrowding, and sometimes simple oversight can lead to housing arrangements that put child predators at risk. The fact that Cole was sharing a cell with Welsh, who is now suspected in his killing, points to potential flaws in the assessment of compatibility or risk when making housing assignments. Moreover, Cole's case illustrates the complex moral questions surrounding violence against child predators in prison. While his killing, like any homicide, is legally a crime, public reaction to such incidents often reveals a disturbing ambivalence. Comments on news articles reporting Cole's death frequently expressed a lack of sympathy or even satisfaction, reflecting a broader societal attitude that sometimes views violence against child predators as a form of rough justice. This attitude ignores an important reality. Regardless of their crimes, inmates like Cole are under the state's care, and their safety is the responsibility of prison authorities. When they're killed in custody, it represents not just a crime, but a failure of the system to fulfill its basic obligation to maintain order and protect those in its charge. As of the latest reports, the investigation into Cole's death is ongoing, with Welsh expected to face murder charges if the evidence supports it. However, the case has already highlighted the persistent dangers that child predators face in prison and the challenges of maintaining safety in a system where certain crimes mark inmates as targets from the moment they arrive. Cole's story serves as a grim reminder that despite increased awareness of prison violence and efforts to protect vulnerable inmates, child predators continue to face extreme risks behind bars, often at the hands of those housed closest to them. Unlike the previous cases where killers proudly admitted their actions, Robert E. Cole's mysterious death reminds us that violence against child predators often happens in shadows. But perhaps most haunting is our next case, a 79-year-old who predicted his own violent fate behind bars with terrifying accuracy, Nelson J. Sanderson. The story of Nelson J. Sanderson provides yet another tragic example of the dangers child predators face in prison, this time in Florida's correctional system. Sanderson, 79, was serving 2 life sentences at Century Correctional Institution for sex offenses, involving a juvenile when his life came to a violent end in August 2020. According to reports from the Florida Department of Corrections, Sanderson was found unresponsive in his dormitory following an assault by another inmate, Markel Brent Sawyer. Despite immediate medical attention, Sanderson was pronounced dead at the scene, making him one of the oldest inmates to be killed in Florida's prison system in recent years. What sets Sanderson's case apart is not just his advanced age, but the context surrounding his incarceration and death. Friends and family revealed that Sanderson had been terrified of going to prison, specifically because he feared he would be killed due to the nature of his crimes. His worst fears were ultimately realized. Despite being housed in what was supposed to be a safer environment for vulnerable inmates, Sanderson's killer, Sawyer, was serving a 20-year sentence for robbery with a weapon. After the attack, he was transferred to Santa Rosa Correctional Institution, facing additional charges of second-degree murder. The exact motive for the killing wasn't immediately clear from official reports, but given Sanderson's conviction for crimes against children, it's not difficult to infer that the nature of his offenses likely played a role. Sanderson's case highlights several important aspects of prison life for child predators. First, it demonstrates that age offers little protection from violence. Even elderly inmates convicted of crimes against children remain targets. Second, it underscores the fears that many sex offenders carry with them into the prison system. Fears that, as in Sanderson's case, are often well-founded. Moreover, the incident raises questions about the effectiveness of Florida's measures to protect vulnerable inmates. Century Correctional Institution is not a high-security facility, and while it does have procedures for housing vulnerable inmates separately, these protections clearly failed in Sanderson's case. The case also illustrates the broader pattern of violence against sex offenders in prisons nationwide. Studies consistently show that inmates convicted of crimes against children face higher rates of victimization than almost any other category of prisoner. This heightened risk exists despite the fact that many correctional systems have protocols specifically designed to protect them, such as separate housing units or protective custody arrangements. Perhaps most disturbingly, public reaction to Sanderson's death followed a familiar pattern seen in similar cases. Many commenters on news articles expressed approval or indifference. This attitude reflects a broader societal view that sometimes sees violence violence against child predators as acceptable or even desirable, despite the fact that such violence undermines the rule of law and the principle that punishment should be determined by courts, not fellow inmates. Sanderson's killing, like the others discussed in this video, points to a fundamental tension in how society views justice for those who harm children. While the legal system prescribes specific punishments for these crimes, there seems to be an unspoken acceptance, or even expectation, that additional punishment will be meted out within prison walls. This expectation places correctional officers in a difficult position, torn between their duty to protect all inmates and societal attitudes that may tacitly approve of violence against certain categories of offenders. Nelson Sanderson's fears of dying in prison for his crimes against children ultimately came true, highlighting the predictable danger these offenders face. However, not all child predators experience the same fate behind bars. Jared Fogle. Our final case presents a different perspective on what happens to child predators in prison. Jared Fogle, once the famous face of Subway sandwiches, became one of the most high-profile child predators when convicted in 2015 of receiving child pornography and traveling to engage in illicit sexual conduct with minors. Fogle's case shocked the nation partly because of how dramatically it contrasted with his public persona. For years, he had been known as the Subway guy, the ordinary man who lost 245 pounds by eating Subway sandwiches. His everyman image made him relatable and trustworthy to millions.
Usually, in the cases that we cover involving celebrities, they are universally adored for their incredible skills and over time have lost touch with their own humanity. They feel above normal people and therefore not beholden to any law. However, that couldn't be further from the truth with today's subject, as he made millions and gained fame by simply eating a sandwich every day.
Behind this wholesome facade lay a disturbing reality. Fogle established the Jared Foundation, ostensibly to combat childhood obesity, but it became a vehicle for him to access minors. This foundation never issued any grants toward preventing childhood obesity. Instead, Fogle used it to connect with children at schools and events. The investigation into Fogle began with his associate, Russell Taylor, the executive director of the Jared Foundation, who was arrested in 2015 for producing and possessing child pornography. When authorities raided Fogle's home, they found incriminating evidence linking him to these crimes.
When Taylor had been arrested and his phone had been taken from him, the police found that Taylor had recently sent Jared a video featuring a child, and that Jared had sent multiple texts, thanking Taylor for, quote, getting daddy his fix.
In November 2015, Fogle was sentenced to 15 years and 8 months in prison after pleading guilty. He was also ordered to pay $1.4 million in restitution to 14 victims. Unlike other cases we've discussed, Fogle's prison experience has been notably different. While child predators often face severe violence in prison, Fogle's time at the Federal Correctional Institution in Englewood, Colorado, has been relatively comfortable, though not without incidents. Shortly after arriving in 2016, Fogle was reportedly assaulted by another inmate, suffering a bloody nose and facial bruising. The attacker, Steve Nigg, told media he targeted Fogle because he was so proud of himself and received preferential treatment due to his celebrity status. Despite this initial incident, Fogle's subsequent prison experience has been described as comfortable. According to former inmates, Fogle has had access to various amenities and programs in the low-security facility.
Jared has been living rather comfortably, according to a former inmate who was incarcerated with him. According to Mark Brooks, in 2019, Jared was living the high life in prison. Because he was in a well-respected, low-security prison, Jared had access to a bevy of self-improvement programs and classes that he was readily taking advantage of.
In a 2021 letter responding to media inquiries, Fogle described his daily life as revolving around exercise, reading, and watching football on weekends.
I realize I royally screwed up to wind up here where I am. I was selfish and entitled. I think about all the people I've let down every single day, especially my family. All I can do is learn from my stupid mistakes to be a better man when I am released in a few years.
The relative comfort of Fogle's incarceration raises questions about the disparity in how different child predators are treated within the prison system. While inmates like Gioan, Dyer, and others faced extreme violence and death, Fogle resides in a facility where his main complaints involve missing small things, like walking barefoot on carpet. Several factors likely contribute to this difference. Fogle is in the federal system with better resources and safety protocols. As a high-profile inmate, he receives more protection, and the minimum security nature of his facility houses primarily non-violent offenders. Despite his attempts at self-improvement, there are troubling indications that Fogle hasn't fully reckoned with his crimes. In 2018, he tried to appeal his sentence, arguing that the judge was biased because she had young daughters. Recent reports also suggest he continues to receive romantic attention from women outside prison.
Well, yeah, you could definitely send pictures, yeah, absolutely. in fact, I wrote you back my letter. You could definitely send me pictures.
Okay, what is the guidelines on sending pictures?
What's that?
What is the guidelines on sending pictures to you?
You can't show boobs or pussy or anything like that.
Okay.
Fogle is scheduled for release in March 2029. His case illustrates how a child predator's prison experience can vary dramatically based on factors like prison system, security level, and the inmate's prior status. For more content like this, click on the videos showing on your screen now.